Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, this is going to be the 0 to hero run on the Shadow Dagger list, Shadow Cascade Bladedancer. So, if you don't know, I have a very tense relationship with Shadow Daggers, mainly because it's been meta relevant for the past 3 years now, and it kind of homogenizes builds in a way that is just not really fun, and it kind of just takes over the entire mastery as being the only way to play the game, essentially, right? And I don't really like that. As someone who makes a lot of builds and plays a lot of stuff and has fun with that, Shadow Daggers is kind of like the antithesis of everything I work for. But so they've actually copped a nerf a while back, and I'm going to assume they're going to cop another nerf. Like, I'm talking about like a substantial one, because it keeps popping up constantly. Like, for instance, recently, one of the best meta builds for Falcon outside of Ballista is Shadow Dagger Falconer with the boots, the Razorfall boots. And the main reason why this build works so well is because Shadow Daggers. So I'm going to assume that Shadow Daggers in general is just going to get another nerf. Now, of course, that means that there's some open design space in terms of Bladedancer builds, because Bladedancer is really focused on doing either melee damage or throwing damage or ailment damage, and Shadow Daggers was like both of those. This means that I can play Shadow Cascade again and have some fun. So there's a node inside Shadow Cascade that turns it into a throwing attack that you throw out a bunch of daggers. And this has been used for ailments before, and it's also been used for Shadow Daggers before. I've played a Bleed Shadow Cascade Bladedancer with these nodes before, and it's a very fun build. Now, I never tried a crit version, because why would you just play a crit throwing Bladedancer if you could just play Shadow Daggers, right? Now, of course, I just want to let you know that you should be clicking on the Shadow Dagger nodes for this build. This node here inside Umbral Blades, and this node here as well inside Shadow Cascade. You should just click on these, and I will leave those in the planner as well. I will make sure that they're in the planner just to make sure that you guys actually use Shadow Daggers, because I think even after they get nerfed, they're still going to be very usable on this build as just extra DPS. But I wanted to see if the build could function without it, because it would be very, very sad if like they nerfed Umbral Blades and nerfed like Shadow Cascade and nerfed like, all the nodes and stuff like that, and there to not be a fun rogue build to play. So that's where we're at. We're playing a crit throwing Shadow Cascade build. Of course, Umbral Blade always sneaks in there a little bit, but it's actually not that much DPS in comparison to our Shadow Cascade. There's actually some new tech with Shadow Cascade. Not many people utilize this back in the day, but recently Wander Dota and a few other people, they've been focusing on the node that makes it so that you do 100% more damage if you have a specific amount of shadows, in this case 4. And this means that you do not grab the node at the top of Bladedancer that gives you the extra shadow, so you stay at 4 shadows, meaning that we never go over that much, which means we get 100% more damage with Shadow Cascade, which ends up being a very large amount of damage, right? And of course, we can put a bunch of throwing flat damage on our gear, and we can put just a bunch of crit, and we're good to go after that. One really cool thing is this build was actually buffed when they reworked how throwing damage worked on affixes, because before, back in the day, throwing damage was just a percentage increased damage instead of like flat damage. It was very hard to get flat throwing damage back in the day. And that didn't really mesh well with Shadow Cascade, because you can get a lot of your percent damage from idols, affixes, and damage with shadows. So it wasn't very good for you to have even more percent increased damage. But thankfully, now that it is flat adaptive damage, all of that increased damage that Shadow Cascade has becomes very strong, right? Cool. Now, also as well, they released the perfect unique for this build, the tongue, the unique dagger. When it's in your offhand, you get like 13% base crit. It's insane. It's probably going to get nerfed into the fucking ground, I will state. This thing is disgusting and will probably get nerfed into the ground, just mind you. But if they do that, we can just wear a Peak of the Mountain to cap our crit anyways, as we're not using leech that much anyways. So all in all, this allows us to cap our crit very quickly, which means we can focus all of our affixes on just flat damage. Now, in the footage you'll see in the later Harbingers, I'm not doing that much damage. That's because I went for a much more defensive approach with my gearing. Like, for instance, a good example here is there's Morning Frost, right? I'm not using those currently because I don't have the dexterity to abuse that, because I don't have the gear to abuse that. But in theory, in the end game, every single affix on your gear should either have dex, percent damage, or flat throwing damage. And you can get up to like 100 dex with Morning Frost on top of all your flat throwing and all that. And that could lead to a very large amount of damage, and the damage scaling is there. I just did not have Morning Frost on because I put on a pair of Atera's Path because, like, I just didn't want to get one tapped by Harbingers constantly in the late game. But trust me, it doesn't seem like as though there's that much damage here. But if you spec the Shadow Dagger node while also using Morning Frost, you'll be doing significantly more damage than what I'm doing in the clip. It's just, I wanted to not die with my shitty gear after only like maybe 10 hours of playtime. But yeah, that's going to be it for this. If you haven't already, I would heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that is the best way of currently supporting me. I've done 13 0 to hero runs so far. That means I've done a total of 130 Harbingers back to back. And let me tell you, it's slowly driving me insane. But thankfully, the knowledge that I've gained from this will be very useful by the community, as now we know like the meta in terms of pushing corruption, getting through your Harbingers, and which Harbingers to choose, which I'll be making a video on. Also, as well, if you want to catch me live on twitch.tv, dreadful__, the link for that will be down in the description if you want to see me work on this kind of stuff live and ask me questions. I don't mind answering people's questions. They come in stream. If you come in with a build planner, I can help you with your build. Seriously, just come check out the stream sometimes. All that being said, let's start the video, shall we? The 13th time to click on character select. This feels like home. Ignore the name. I usually name characters that I think that are going to fail a very dumb name, mainly because like it's kind of a bet I have with myself. It's like, you know what? If this really weird bad build ends up being good enough for this series, it can keep the bad name. But we kind of played Flurry on stream the other day, and it was so dramatically awful that we had to, pay homage to our fallen brother, Flurry, which didn't even make it 2 monoliths, by the way, before shitting on itself. So yeah, don't play Flurry, folks, but we're going to level with Flurry for a little bit until we get access to, of course, Acid Flask, then Acid Flask into Puncture, then into Umbral Blades, like we normally do on this channel, because, the rogue leveling meta hasn't really changed that much. I feel really bad for skipping parts of the leveling, but like I really don't have anything to say about this. Like, leveling has just been the same for Rogue since like we found out about the tech between Puncture and Umbral Blades. Like, there's a few other ways to level Rogue that I'm aware of, but like this is my comfort pick, in my opinion. Like, it feels amazing early on. One thing I did actually change up this time was I actually spec'd into Smoke Bomb instead of usually speccing into Shift. That's because Smoke Bomb has like a bunch of puncture bleed chance inside of it if you're sitting in the smoke cloud. Turns out that's pretty okay for this build, or at least for early on, because just all that extra bleed chance is just so much extra damage. I'll be honest, I kind of just usually spec Shift because I get to places faster, but having extra damage helps. Speaking about damage, here's the Void Amalgam. We, of course, have access to Umbral Blades and Puncture at this point. Lots and lots of damage ramping, as you can see. And this is why it's been such a comfort pick for me, because I'll be honest, last Epoch's bosses right now are absolute bullet sponges that aren't really that interesting. So being able to skip them like this with a build that actually does a lot of damage is very entertaining, I will say. Now we take the dub on the Emperor's Remains, and we move on. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. I did swap into Shadow Cascade, so I'm speccing into Shift, into Shadow Cascade, and into Synchronized Strike, and we're trying to go crit. Right now I have like double Dagger going on, and I got like 30% crit, which is pretty okay for early on. Like, that's pretty okay. The only problem is during the whole leveling process, I didn't drop any throwing flat, so my damage was very poor in general. Like my damage felt much poorer than it should have been, and you'll see that on Hearten here. So yeah, here's Hearten. I would definitely suggest not swapping this early like I did. If you're gonna follow this leveling planner that I put out, do not swap this early. I would swap later when you have some throwing flat on gear and maybe just better gear in general. This felt really bad in general to swap too really early. I just don't have the damage to make up for it. I'll definitely suggest waiting till you have like 4 skill specialization slots. You can play bleed, puncture plus umbral blades all the way to empowered monoliths and probably your first few you know, harbingers and stuff like that. So play the bleed, puncture, umbral blades until you feel comfortable swapping, in my opinion. Because swapping this early on felt atrocious. By the time I get to the twins, it's a little bit better because I can specialize into smoke bomb. And smoke bomb recently got giga buff for throwing builds in general, where they made it so that you can get a lot of flat throwing from it instead of getting percent throwing from smoke blades. And just standing inside the smoke bomb area just made it feel a lot better. Now, of course, right now the build isn't like doing the most damage ever, but I completely blame just like not having any throwing flat at this point other than the throwing flat applied by smoke bomb. Like, I got really unlucky with that. Now here's our first monolith. Thankfully Rogue has the mobility to kind of zoom in the early game. Like I said, the damage scaling still isn't there yet. It's weird, dude. It's like really weird. Like, so I think it's just lack of flat, man. Like, I'm literally having problems with the amount of flat that I have on gear. This gameplay was caught before I was streaming today on the character, and then I started streaming and I started getting a lot luckier with my drops and actually started to get crit chance and stuff like that. And it felt a lot better then, but I can tell you these early portions of the character felt a lot more balanced as a rogue, if that makes sense, right? Like, it feels a lot more fair. But as we push up and actually get pieces of gear with actual stats on them, it feels way better. Like, the scaling on this character scales so hard on gear. The mechanics are there, we just don't have the gear to kind of like back it up yet. But I'm still like kind of desperately rummaging through the gear on the ground, trying to find anything that can help. Of course, this is before I put it on the loot filter. For some reason, the loot filter was off for this portion. Whatever, but like I have it later. But still, I think that like this build takes a little bit longer to get started. Now, of course, if you just spec'd into the shadow dagger nodes, it wouldn't even be that bad. So I would heavily suggest probably just spec into the shadow dagger nodes. Like I said, I'm doing it because I just want to make sure the build functions even after the Shadow Dagger nerfs, but you don't have to live by those kind of rules. You can just have fun at home, you know? Cool. So here's our A-bomb kill. To give you an idea of what I mean about the early growing pains of the build without the Shadow Daggers nodes, this takes, I think, 3 times as long as like the Avalanche build takes, the Shaman one. So definitely not the most damage ever, but still enough to get through him easily, right? Now this is where we finally spec'd into our 5th skill, allowing us to drop Umbral Blades when we, of course, consume our shadows. Turns out when you're playing just a generic throwing build and you have the ability to just throw in Umbral Blades, they do pretty well. Even without the Shadow Dagger nodes, they still do pretty well. And at this point in the character, if you do have the Shadow Dagger nodes, which I believe you should have, by the way, at this point, it would be really strong because you'd be doing a lot of damage, even though like your actual skills aren't doing that much damage. But I can tell you that your skills later on still do plenty of damage in comparison to the Shadow Dagger counterparts. It's just Shadow Daggers is just so strong that like it's hard to not play with them. But like I said, all the footage you see here without Shadow Daggers, so even if Shadow Daggers get nuked from orbit, still a good build. Coolio. Here's my Rai. It was actually something interesting. I went and looked around, and it seems like as though no matter what build I'm playing, Rai just takes a while to kill. I don't know if he has like higher HP thresholds than other like bosses have, but like in general, I've just noticed these take longer than all the other bosses for some reason. Now, if I think about it, it's probably because you have to dodge him a lot more. Because let's be real, who the fuck has capped void res and actual amounts of HP at this point in the campaign? So, of course, actually having to dodge the boss attacks instead of just DPSing them down is important. As you can see, now that we're actually getting some gear on, the clear is starting to feel a lot better. Like I'm starting to get into that kind of rogue rhythm where I just simply synchronize strike, shift, and sometimes I will say you do have to use self-cast Shadow Cascade because you don't have enough cooldown recovery speed scaling to actually use your thing. Yes, I can see the lag. You know what? I'll just leave it in just to show you guys that like yes, last Epoch still lags unfortunately. Here's my Lagan kill. Most of it was just me waiting for the phase to end, kind of funnily enough. As you can see, that damage scaling is already starting to get a lot better, even with me having to essentially dodge everything for at threat of my life because it only takes one crit from the waves to instantly kill me. In comparison, Dragon here, he doesn't take that long. That's because all of the Umbral Blades and everything, like all of it hits the same target. I do have to like do a little bit of maneuvering here to stay out of the necrotic explosions and stuff like that. But in general, we're finally starting to become a quote unquote good build at this point. This is like where I would say the build starts to actually feel good in comparison to like 20 levels ago where it just didn't feel good. We even have the ward on shadow creation, which is amazing. Speaking of, to showcase the ward on shadow creation, here's our first level 90 mono. As you can see, as we put down our shadows, we just get a decent chunk of ward. This is a very good defensive layer for rogues to have in general. Like in the end game, I have like 2400 HP, and whenever I use my ability, I get to like 20, I get like 400 extra ward, which ends up helping a lot in the end game, not in the ways that you would think. So the reason why it ends up being good is because you have two ways to sustain your HP pool. In this case, we have all of the life after creation after synchronized strike, which is cool, right? Then we have all of the ward as well. So we're going from only getting like all of our life back, but now we're getting a little bit on top of that as well, which increases our overall sustain. So that's just as important as increasing our max hit because like, there's very dangerous things in the end game that hit very hard very quickly. Like for instance, Osprix Raiders. It's like what makes you feel good against that. That's why vessel builds end up feeling a lot better to play than like, let's say, I don't know, like a good example here is like a low life build. Low life builds have very good max hits, but getting up back to that max hit takes forever, right? And while that's cool and all, but sometimes you just need good sustain to make your build feel a lot better. That's why ward on shadow creation is really good. We also did get tongue, which has given us a lot of extra DPS. As soon as I put it on, we went from like 30% crit all the way to like 60 to 70% crit. And at the end of the, video, we're crit capped as well, which feels great. But the tongue definitely does its work here. It will probably get nerfed, by the way. I will warn you. But of course, you could always just run Peak of the Mountain instead as well on top of this, which would be just fine. That's one thing I will say about this build is its investment. The amount, like if you're to choose a build to be like, I'm going to play this build and only this for you, a build like this is the kind of build you're looking for that scales very hard on gear in general, like just in general, because of course, I can get a tongue with extra LP on it with crit and crit multi. I can get a Peak of the Mountain as well, which will open up some affix slots and passive points. Like you just get so much. Also, we skipped the Herat second phase there, by the way. Now here's our first Harbinger, Harbinger of Fear. As always, Harbinger of Fear here. Just gonna quickly wipe him out here. Plenty of damage. I'll be honest, I'm slowly kind of gravitating towards doing the anti-melee Harbinger and Spirits of Fire first, and then moving on into Harbinger of Fear after like maybe, Harbinger of Chaos or something like that. Mainly just because of late, the Harbinger of Fear hasn't felt as difficult as like the Harbinger of like the stupid Spirits of Fire one, right? Of course, unlocking Empowered Monos means we go and unlock COF as well to get those juicy bonuses. Now here's our first Empowered Mono. I will say I felt very squishy here. That is just because my reses weren't capped. I don't have that much HP on my gear. And overall, I just felt a lot squishier in general. One thing to note, I will say, is I feel as though my shadow, like my synchronized strike rotation isn't as fast as I would want it to be. One thing that I would change if I could go back in time and fix it, would be to have like one attack speed roll on my gear, probably on the katana in the late game, making it so that, you know, my synchronized strike was a little bit faster, maybe getting some more attack speed on the tree. Just getting some melee attack speed for the quality of life is probably going to make it feel a lot better. And eventually when you get plus levels on Shadow Cascade, you can get more damage from that too. To give you an idea of what we're working with here, here's the DPS right now. As you can see, very big numbers. As always, this is without Shadow Daggers. You'd probably have way bigger numbers if you did have Shadow Daggers at this point. Now here it is, the hardest part of the run, the Harbinger of Chaos. One big problem with the Harbinger of Chaos is when we have this low of HP in gear, what will tend to happen is you will get stunned by the waves that she summons. Like those waves, you'll get stunned by it. Like there, I got stunned. And if you're not moving while you're a rogue, you're screwed in general. You really want to be mobile in general, just in general. Like you just want to just not get hit in general. That's like your main defensive mechanic on bosses, is just simply to be kind of slippery in general. You do enough burst damage with this build that you can afford to take your time with the boss instead of like immediately nuking them down and stuff like that. Like for instance, if you're playing like a Primalist with like a bunch of leech and stuff like that, you definitely want to stay on the boss the whole time. But for a build like this where you have a lot of burst damage, you don't really need to be on their face constantly, right? But that's Harbinger of Chaos. And of course, as is tradition, just to give you an idea of the power creep, how much HP Harbingers have in comparison to all the other bosses in the game, here's an Orbis. He does not last that long, as we do a lot of damage, as you can see. Oh, look at that, even more damage. Oh, about to kill him here, I think, with one more rotation. Nope, one extra one. And there you go. Boop. So here I was trying to go for more boots, because I was trying to go for some Morning Frost to slam, because I wanted to get a pair of Morning Frost with HP on them specifically, but I never ended up getting a pair with HP on them. So I ended up just using an Atera's Path later on. But in theory, in the late game, when you actually have good gear scaling and stuff like that, you definitely want a pair of Morning Frost with, like, of course, as you can see, get a Razor Fall, of course, because why not, right? One of the best items to be running on Falconer, right? Whatever. There's my Morning Frost and stuff like that. And we tried to slam it, but we didn't end up getting HP from it at all. Here's the Harbinger of Ash. He's very annoying as this build, as we're kind of a melee build in general, because we do have to position our shadows next to him, even though we're kind of ranged, right? But what you can do here is you can kind of like bait him into the shadow creation by walking to the other side of the arena when he puts down that gigantic necrotic dot puddle there. As you can see, that's like the problem with this boss in general, is that necrotic dot puddle. If it wasn't for that, this would be a fine fight, because the Harbinger of Ash, or just Harbingers in general, the fat ones, they're very easy to kind of like stick near and run around with. But because of the fact that he has that necrotic dot pool, we do have to unfortunately kind of move the Harbinger around the arena so that we're not instantly dying to a very big necrotic dot pool, right? Because we're a rogue. None of our defenses help against damage over time, so we definitely don't want to be standing in that. So we would definitely want to like make sure that the boss is coming to where we want to. But thankfully, because of the kit that Rogue has, we're very mobile. Here's another Orbis. This one took a little bit longer, mainly just because of the fact it's a blood Orbis with the little heat-seeking missiles that he sends out, those little purple ones. They're very annoying for a rogue because they do very large amounts of damage, and, of course, you can't easily dodge them, can you? Now here, I'm trying to slam a 2LP Trader's Tongue with a decent item, but I end up getting both suffixes, unfortunately, causing me to rage a little bit inside. As you can see here, Ripperoni, my Trader's Tongue. Rip. Now, here's Harbinger of Treason. This one actually went a lot easier than normal, thanks to the full heal that Synchronized Strike gives you alongside the ward when you create a shadow. You can end up face tanking a lot of what the Harbinger of Treason does. Of course, you should still dodge things while you can, but the damage over time isn't as effective against you because you literally just heal to full every single time you use your attacks, right? And the leech from the smoke bomb stuff too feels pretty good. So overall, you end up just feeling pretty good with this build against this boss. This boss is kind of a menace versus certain builds that can't target the worms and stuff like that, but just kill the worm on the right, and all of a sudden, this boss ends up getting a lot easier than it normally would be. Another Oribus. I've been getting a lot better at pushing corruption very quickly. So I've been doing a bunch of Oribuses in a row to push up my corruption to get to 300 corruption. So I get better favor, well, not favor, but better stability rates as I push through monoliths. Speaking of, here's a monolith at 281 corruption. We got up here very quickly this time around, mainly just because we had access to 2 Harbinger needles in a row, which jumped us from like 150 corruption all the way to 281 corruption. That's just how strong needles are, right? Harbinger needles are very strong, and they can lead you to getting to 300 corruption much quicker. And of course, when you're in 300 corruption and you start pushing out of the center, you end up getting a lot more stability per monolith echo, which means you'll run less echoes, and that means less time running in between, of course, bosses, which means more bosses, right? And that's really all this run is just a glorified boss rush, to be honest with you. After you get done with like the Harbinger of Ash and the Harbinger of Chaos, everything else is just stupid simple because you can easily dodge them properly. Like the Harbingers are not the most difficult boss fights of all. They're just very involved ones. Like knowing how to fight them isn't that hard. It's just they're more of an endurance test because they just have gigantic loads of HP on them. Speaking of, here's the 5th Harbinger. This one actually gave me a little bit of difficulty, not because for the reasons you would think. It's mainly because of those dot pools. They get you can't see them under smoke bomb. So I actually died once against this guy, mainly because of that. Because what I would do is I'd put down my smoke bomb and try to sit in it to get the smoke blades buff to speed up the boss kill, right? Which you should be doing for extra damage, right? The problem is I can't fucking see shit while in it. Now, that's funny and all, hardy har, it's flavorful because it's a smoke bomb, but holy crap, dude. Like, can I just see the fucking stupid cold puddles under my AoE, please? It's so freaking obnoxious. This build ends up being so much screen cancer that you just can't see the dot pools under you, and it just doesn't feel good. It just doesn't feel good. But yeah, that's why I had any sorts of difficulty with this. Mainly, the strategy is to pull him away from his dot pools, as most of the Harbingers, they are heat-seeking missiles. They will chase you down to the end of the earth, so you definitely want to abuse that fact and move them out of their atrocious AoEs that you have to deal with constantly. Now here's another Trader's Tongue. This time it's going to be a 1 LP one with 3 good affixes on the item. I'm sure you guys can guess what the actual outcome is going to be. Oh, look at that. The bleed chance and rip. Rip to the item. I'm very sad right now. Here's another Oribus, and thankfully this time it's not a blood Oribus, meaning we can kill him much quicker. As you can tell though, we're just really trying really hard to push up the corruption as fast as possible because I'll be honest, this build can handle it. Just like this build can handle it, especially if you have the Shadow Dagger nodes, unlike me, right? Right now, you'd be killing stuff way faster. It's just, like I said, want to test the build without Shadow Daggers. Here's another quick showcase of Monolith gameplay. Of late, as the Zero to Hero runs have matured in terms of what I'm trying to do with them, they've been pushing more and more into the style of just boss rushing, and I haven't been showing as much gameplay of monoliths because I'll be honest, like it's kind of the same. It's the same stuff, it's just monoliths again. Thankfully, it seems like as though we're getting a change to all of this next patch. So hopefully, cool, right? We'll see. But in general, it's just me going from Harbinger to Harbinger to Harbinger with just, bouts of monoliths in between. Thankfully, I feel as though they're finally going to fix this. All right, now the boss rushing has commenced. Now for the quick time, we got the Harbinger of Pride down. Got the Harbinger of Defilement down as well. This one was a little bit more difficult, mainly because I had to stay at range from him a lot more to avoid the void dot pools. But other than that, it's not that hard. Harbinger of Tyranny. I'll be honest, Heorot's way more difficult than this guy, mainly because Heorot likes to shove himself into the wall, and having to deal with him in the wall instead of like in the open area is such a different boss fight. So that's why this boss fight ends up taking so long. Not because the Harbinger of Tyranny, he's kind of a pushover. It's because of the Heorot beforehand, because he can bug out. The Heorot sucks. Another Harbinger of Defilement here. Pretty much almost done with the run. This one wasn't that bad of a Harbinger to fight. The little necrotic dot pool can be baited out, so it ends up not being that difficult, to be honest with you. I'm getting a little too good at these runs, man. They're not as fun anymore. And now I'll let the Harbinger of Destruction play out as I talk about the build and how I felt about it. I felt as though the single target DPS was starting to dip a little bit in the late game, but that's for a myriad of different reasons. First off, I'm not running the Shadow Dagger nodes. You should be running the Shadow Dagger nodes, which would make it a lot more effective for you, right? Please do that. Don't hurt yourself on my account. I just wanted to try without the Shadow Dagger nodes to prove the build was functional outside of Shadow Daggers. Cool, right? Next thing's off. Shadow Cascade has been nerfed into the ground multiple times, but then they introduce the Harbingers with gigantic amounts of HP, and of course the corruption rework and the boss ward stuff, which ends up making Shadow Cascade just a less effective skill than before, because it just kind of got power crept in terms of just how much HP they give everything right these days, and how much, fucking HP, like how much damage you need to chew through these guys at a respectable pace, like it starts to get a little annoying in general to make builds around this. But so the single target was but it'll be great with Shadow Daggers. The tankiness is pretty good. It's as good as a Bladedancer can get. You have always the fear of getting one tapped in your mind, but your sustain is like amazing. And the clear is amazing, as it always is with a Shadow Cascade build, to be honest. All right, here we are in game, Rogue Enjoyers. So let's talk about Shadow Cascade here. So the main thing, of course, is to grab Porcupine's Wrath to turn it into a throwing skill, so we can just do more damage with the daggers. This is like good when you're focusing on either this or the Shadow Daggers, but definitely like if you think about it, right, if you're trying to scale both for like bleed, you definitely want to just go with daggers and the melee at the same time, because you'd end up with better like AoE coverage and single target that way. So I think in the future, if you're to play bleed Shadow Cascade, you definitely don't grab Porcupine's Wrath. It's a little weird. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it, but still feels good. Just grab all the more damage here. Grab the more damage here for shadows. We don't grab the node at the top of Bladedancer, so that we don't have to deal with the shadow management. So we're always at 4 shadows no matter what, whenever we use Synchronized Strike, even though we have the extra shadow after shifting, makes it so that we get 100% more damage. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this. You can get more damage utilizing like leverage momentum and stuff like that, but I found that this to be the easiest way to get more damage on a budget. And then, of course, as well, the mana refund, the mana after shadow, and the shadow on kill. We have the shadow on kill for a completely different reason than you might think. We have a lot of ward gained when you create a shadow. This essentially becomes ward gained when you kill enemies as well. If you utilize the on kill node here in Gloomstalker, ends up being a lot of extra ward, and it feels pretty good. Pretty good. That's pretty much it for Shadow Cascade. Pretty simple tree. Synchronized Strike, pretty simple utility tree. Nothing too crazy there. I won't really go into it because, like, if you've played Rogue before, you know how Synchronized Strike works. It's very easy to understand. Shift here. Shift is simply here to proc our Dancing Shadows, Shadow Cascade after Shift. Just gives us a free proc of Shift. of Shadow Cascade. Lots of extra Shadow Cascades, feels really good to play with. Also as well gives us some vulnerability. We can also eventually get a lot of dodge rating as well, and a lot of movement speed. Eventually you're going to want some cooldown recovery speed for shift in general to make it feel a lot better, but right now we just have a Shadow Cascade on our bar to utilize when we're on cooldown still on shift. And that's pretty much it for shift here. Now for Smoke Bomb, all we really care about is Smoke Blades for the gigantic amount of flat throwing that we get. We care about the Silver Shroud. Cool. We care about the shadows on use. The reason why we care about this is the same reason why we have the shadow on kill on Shadow Cascade. The idea, we plop our Smoke Bomb down and we get a bunch of ward per second, thanks to our, when you create a shadow, get ward kind of thing, right? And of course, just dust rods as well, because why not? And that's pretty much it for Smoke Bomb. Then for Umbral Blades, mainly we're just focusing on just the explosion setup. Like, this is a pretty stereotypical setup. Dropping after we use a shadow just means that we just get a bunch of extra Umbral Blades. It doesn't actually end up doing that much damage on single target, but of course, if you're going the Shadow Dagger route, it will actually lead to a lot of single target, right? So make sure to grab Lethal Darkness and make sure to also grab Shadow Elegance. I just simply did not do it myself because I wanted to test non-Shadow Daggers. But of course, just simply click these two nodes and you'll be doing significantly more damage. And that's pretty much it for the skills. Now for the passives that are important, nothing too crazy here this time around. Just getting all this extra crit, right? Getting crit, getting the percent damage based on our movement speed, right? Getting the flat damage here in the attack speed, just a little bit of attack speed to make our skills feel a lot better. I did talk about how, like, I would suggest putting in a little bit more effort in your attack speed just to make Sync Strike feel better, but you don't need too much. Even more HP from Falconer, so we don't like end up being a squishy bitch. Bladedancer here, just glancing blow, HP. Like, there's a bunch of throwing flat here, which is really cool. Some dodge as well if we've been hit recently. This health gained on Shadow Creation on top of the health gained on Shadow Creation inside Synchronized Strike ends up completely covering your HP in general, so you don't feel as bad for spamming Sync Strike, because, you know, you get HP back and it leads to you just feeling just so much better. And of course, you'd have more damage with Shadow Daggers against rares and bosses as well if you grab this node as well, which would be good if you were actually playing Shadow Daggers, unlike me right now. Of course, as well, the crit chance here, we have a dagger and a sword, so we get 160% crit chance. That on top of the crit chance we get from this node, and of course, having a Trader's Tongue gives us all the way to a 93% generic crit chance, making it feel really good in endgame, because we're capped on crit thanks to the crit vuln at the top of the tree here. Also as well, just the armor shred. I actually have enough armor shred now. I could probably take this node off, but early on, you can take this node before you have armor shred on your gear. This gives you frailty and mana regen. You need a decent amount of mana regen to feel good. Right now I'm at 17. I would like a little bit more mana regen, but that's what we got right now. And of course, the crit multi at the top of the tree, right? And for nodes, I would grab, other than that, mainly just getting the attack speed here, that would just make the build feel a lot better. And also as well, you can start filling out dexterity as well, dexterity everywhere, so that you can eventually go into Morning Frost. And that's pretty much it for the passives. Let's talk about gearing. So mandatory uniques. There is no mandatory uniques, although you definitely want to eventually get access to a Traitor's Tongue. If this item is nerfed in the future, you can go for a Peak of the Mountain as well on your helmet, and eventually get an LP Peak of the Mountain and shove all your modifiers on that. But generally, just this. And eventually you'd want a Morning Frost, but right now I'm running in a Terrace Path early on because I wanted to be tanky. I didn't want to be like, I have enough damage, I felt. I wanted to be tanky, right? So I went with a Terrace Path instead. So yeah, cool. So helmet here, throwing damage percent damage here. It could be dex too. Dex would work as well, but mainly just percent damage, increased damage per active shadow, a Shadow Cascade. This is multiplied by 4. So this helmet's giving us 160% increased damage. Feels really good. Amulet here, crit multi, throwing damage flat. You want throwing damage flat wherever you can get it on this build, and then eventually HP and resistance on a good base. Katana here, crit multi, crit chance, shred. I think in Fizz Pen eventually. I think actually inside of that crit chance, either you go for mana regen or you go for attack speed, but I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. Then chests here, increase damage per active shadow cascade, and the ward when you create a shadow. This is very important. This is the kind of affix that you should be beelining for and trying to get on all of your gear and stuff like that and your idols, because it ends up making you feel really, really tanky early on. Feels really good. And of course, HP, a little bit of dodge there too. Probably get it on a better base as well. Trader's Tongue, same thing, like what I have. The chill was kind of cool, so I didn't have to get chill elsewhere, but I'd rather have like crit and crit multi on it, or just mainly crit multi and maybe attack speed or mana regen, something like that. Viz Pen is also acceptable. Ring here, mana regen, throwing flat, resistance, and eventually HP there. Belt here, HP, mana regen, and eventually this would be throwing flat. We're missing an entire affix of throwing flat, which sucks, but it's just how it is. Ring here, throwing flat, eventually dexterity or mana regen there. And then, of course, as well, HP and resistance. Gloves here, there's Loraka's Claws, which is like 100 and something % crit multi on your gloves for your throwing attacks. You could run that because that would work for Shadow Daggers and your throwing attacks. And you can also, of course, get LP on it with some HP or some throwing flat on it. Boots here, like I said, Morning Frost eventually with the good modifiers on it. Relic here, mana regen, that could be crit multi as well, dexterity as well, throwing damage flat, resistance, and HP, and we're good to go there. And that's pretty much it for the gearing. For the idols here, real quick, they're either you want increased damage and ward when you create a shadow. You want ward when you create a shadow and increased damage per active shadow cascade. And that's pretty much it for idols. Like you can get crit multi, and then I'll just fill out the rest with either HP idols like I have here, or go with resistance idols. And that's pretty much it for the character. That's pretty much it for the build. With all that being said, this has been Dread. Off to go do something else. Bye.